David, I'm going to turn it over to you. There's 1,500 employees giving you a warm welcome, and thanks for joining us.
Thank you. Well, James, thank you for that introduction. I do have to correct you. There's one thing you missed. I was president of the ninth grade, my ninth grade class 2 years in a row.
Okay.
It took my kids, when I used to make that joke, it took my kids a while to figure out. They were like, wait, did that mean you repeated the ninth grade? I'm like, yeah, I repeated the ninth grade. So thank you for the introduction, and I'm really, really honored to be here with you all. I think this is such an important conversation you're having, and I love that your title is Courageous Conversations, because I think this is courageous to talk about some of these hard topics that we're all dealing with at this time. So I really appreciate all of you joining us for this. You know, let me start by saying grief is change. You know, another word for grief is change, a change we didn't want. And we're all dealing with a lot of changes these days. And these are certainly all changes we haven't wanted. I got into this. I often say this isn't a profession that you choose. It's more like it chooses you. I wasn't a third grader who, when everyone was saying I want to be a police officer or a fireman, I was like, oh, I want to be a grief expert. It didn't happen that way. I had a mother who was ill when I was growing up. She was always in and out of hospitals. And when I was 13 years old, she had to go to the hospital in the big city, which was a few hours from where we lived. And she was in an ICU. Yeah, I was 13. You had to be 14 to go in, so I wasn't able to see her. And across the street at the hotel where we were, a fire broke out, which when the fire trucks pulled up, they realized there was an active shooter who began shooting at the firemen. So early in my life, I was involved in my mom's dying and one of the first mass shootings in the US. So I dealt with a lot at a young age. And in a strange way, I say what happened to me is I turned out to be someone that maybe could have helped me, because there wasn't a lot of help at that time. So that really got me into this world. I did not think this was going to be my life's work. I was curious about it. When I was in community college, I took a class on death and dying just to learn more about what had happened with my mom. And I studied this woman, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who had written a book called On Death and Dying, and she named the stages: their denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. And years later, this became my work. It became my field. And I didn't think I would ever, much less get to work with Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. You know, I thought it'd be shocking if I get to meet her. But I ended up working with her. And as was mentioned, we did the book Life Lessons. And then we adapted her stages from dying to grief. So when we adapted those stages, we talked about those stages aren't linear. They don't have to be in order. They're not a map for grief. They're just, you know, for people who've never been through any type of grief, knowing there's some scaffolding out there does seem to help them in their understanding that there's a little structure to fall back on to normalize their grief experience. And there's all kinds of griefs in the world. I think about it this way, that something is always the death of something. You know, obviously we think of grief with a loved one dying, but a divorce is the death of a marriage. A job loss is the death of your job in that workplace with those people. We're dealing with a pandemic now that is literally the loss of a world that we had a month ago, that all of us took for granted. We had no idea that that common world was going to disappear and be gone forever. And so people started saying, I'm so sad at night, or I cried last night, or I got up this morning angry, what's going on? And just naming it grief seemed to help so much. Because when we name it, we can sort of claim it and then begin to heal. You know, you can, once you name it, you can take action. You can sort of find some acceptance in this is the reality. What can we do to protect ourselves? How can we minimize this? How can we change things? And I also think about the concept, and I'm sure we'll get into this in some of your questions, about, I think of it as macro and micro griefs. We have big and little griefs, and each one stands alone. And here's what I mean by that. If someone had a spouse die after 40 years, that's a horrific grief that stands alone. At the same time, if someone had to cancel their wedding because of the pandemic that they've been dreaming about since they were 5 years old, that maybe is the worst thing that happened to them. And we don't want to compare those two losses. You know, we have kids that are disappointed they're not going to have graduation, or they're not getting to see their friends. Those are kind of their worst griefs. And part of our work is to validate that and recognize in their world, it is the worst thing that's happened. So I often think of grief as a no judgment zone. So I'm excited to be here. I think there's a lot we're going to get into in your questions. I want to sort of keep mine brief because I want to get into the nitty gritty of what's concerning you. I'm so honored to be here. Like I said, I love the idea of we're having courageous conversations, and I think we're having to push through some of our fears, and fear is out there now. And one of my sayings I often say is, fear doesn't stop death, fear stops life. And I also think I just want to add this, that in the simplicity of what we're trying to find in these new lives, food is so primal. You know, food is our comfort. There's a reason we call it comfort food. And when I heard General Mills, I'm like, oh my gosh, yes. And I was just sharing before we came on about how I'm someone that would go out and get a croissant, a crescent roll. And when this happened, I'm like, how can I do this at home? What can I do? Oh, Pillsbury's got me covered. So I may never go back now that I'm getting used to it. And I got that down to a routine in the morning. So I'm so glad to be with you.
We're hoping there's many more like you who have rediscovered the power of our brands and our food. So,
I think there is. I'm like, Haagen-Dazs, that's them too. I'm on that. So you are partly what's getting me through this. So just know.
Thank you for reaffirming that. All right, so let's jump into the questions. And like I told you, this is two buddies catching up here. So I'm going to rapid fire throw them at you. But one of the things I wanted to start with was, as we got the questions in from employees, one of the themes that came up was, I'm actually not feeling a sense of loss or grief. And is there something wrong with me?
Right.
So the question is there a universal truth about how we all should be feeling right now based on the pandemic?
So I live in Los Angeles. We get earthquakes here. I can remember whatever it was 10 years, 15 years ago when we had our last one. I don't remember if it was the actual earthquake or an aftershock, that I was in a movie theater when it happened. And I noticed there's three types of people in a movie theater when an earthquake happens. There's the people who get up and very quietly, orderly leave in an orderly fashion. There's those who get up and set their hair on fire and run up and down the aisles, screaming, trying to find their way out in a panic. And then there's those who are like, everyone needs to calm down and just watch the movie. It's just an earthquake. So I use that example that all of us respond to this differently. Some of us are going to go, oh my gosh, this is like, I can't believe everything I've got is lost and the world is ending and the sky is falling. And other people are going to be like, okay, what do we need to do about this? And other people are going to be like, do what you need to do. It's fine. I'm not grieving. There's nothing wrong. Let's just do what we need to do. Yep. And there's no right or wrong in this. I mean, there's no prescribed way to handle a pandemic. So don't feel any more than you're feeling, and you don't have to feel any less than you're feeling. Completely fine whoever you are.
All right, that's super helpful. The other piece, and it piggybacks on that, I've got my own point of view on how to navigate it, but how do I support the folks that report to me or that I lead? What are some of the approaches or thoughts you have on how our leaders and managers can support their teams through what is a difficult time?
Well, it is a time to stock up on supplies and food supplies, and you know that as well as anyone. And I applaud you that, the food supply chain's happening really well. Me getting groceries is like Christmas now, but like every week it's Christmas. But however, I also want to say that when we think about the people we work with, everyone, as we just said, does this differently. This does stress out some more than others. So these are moments to really allow people a little more extra room. Someone that I work with on my team the other day sort of snapped in a very curt way, and I went, oh my gosh, that is not like that person.
Mm-hmm.
And I realized they were having some stress at home later. And to understand at this time, everyone has a struggle going on we know nothing about. Whether it's a parent who's ill, a child who's just driving them crazy because they can't play, their internet connect. Everyone has struggles. So I think while we're stocking up on food, we need to stock up on compassion.
Yeah.
And cut people a little more slack. The other thing I want to say is we always talk in the work world about engagement. How can we get better engagement? Managers are taught, walk around the office, say, how are you to each other?
Yep.
This is one of the most crucial, engaging moments we'll ever have.
Mm.
Your employees, people you work with, are not going to remember what you did, but who you were during this. And so this is a moment to create powerful engagement. Someone says to you, I'm having a tough day, or okay, and you send something. This is a moment to show a little extra compassion that they're going to remember long after this is gone.
Yeah, that's really good. Really good. So what I heard was give people the space to show up the way they need to show up, provide the check-ins when possible, and to create a moment because these are lasting moments that will increase the bond of engagement going forward. It's super helpful. Super helpful. All right. So for those employees who are feeling this profound sense of loss, how much should they open up and share with colleagues? Again, today is a format for employees to get a bit vulnerable and share their experience so far with the pandemic. But I'm curious, what is that fine line between sharing my grief and keeping it inside? And what does the sharing actually do for the healing?
Well, let's talk about that in general. So, for example, we all have had the ability to sort of show up in our daily life at work and sort of present the best work version of ourselves.
Yeah.
And we could contain that. Now those containers are gone. We're in each other's homes. We're seeing each other's kids. The pets are jumping around. There's hinges that are coming off in front of each other.
Yep.
So it is a time that it's challenging. And I think it's so important to know who you're talking to. One of the things I think happens in grief or life is if I say to you, James, I'm having a really hard day, and you go, me too, don't got time to talk. I might want to learn, James isn't the best person for me to go to when I have a hard time.
Yep.
So you want to look and see where your support is. And I also think it's so important we recognize, first of all, the context. We're in a pandemic. Just let those words roll off your mouth.
Yeah. Yep.
We're in a pandemic. It's okay to have a problem. You're not weak because you're having trouble getting through a pandemic.
Yep.
You're not, inadequate. And we aren't used to being vulnerable like that. And I think it's all right to realize there's going to be a range that we're all going to be in and to share how hard things are. But if you're sharing it with someone and you're not getting the feedback, don't keep trying. Yeah. One of the things I think we often do is that person's my coworker, or that person's my wife or my husband, they should get this. And if they don't get this, you can't go back to that same well. No matter how many times you walk up and down a hardware store, you're never going to find milk. So recognize who can be supportive and maybe who isn't.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. So my next question, I'll start, and it kind of hits on what you said in your opening remarks, but I'll start with a story. I've got a cousin who is expecting her first child, and a couple days ago, she posted something on Instagram talking about how unique this experience is to have your first child in the midst of a pandemic.
Pandemic, right?
The loss of baby showers, the loss of the opportunities to go shopping for overpriced baby equipment, the loss of partners being able to join you in ultrasounds, Lamaze classes that are canceled. And so she went through the litany of things
Wow.
that
Yeah.
you can't do as an expectant mother. And then she closed her blog post with, but I'm fortunate to be where I am, and I'm doing way better than some other folks who are experiencing much greater loss. So she kind of had the throwaway line of like, my grief is not as catastrophic as the next person's. And so I wanted you to kind of expound a little bit more on this mentality we often have to compare our grief with others and to feel some sort of guilt or shame for the grief that we have, when it's probably best to just acknowledge and own our own loss, because it is the most important loss.
Yeah, there's a sense, there's almost like this pressure to be grateful. And I understand it, and it's not new. I mean, listen, there's people I would counsel who their mother or father had died at 60, 70, 80 years old. And they would go, I guess I shouldn't be sad. I mean, kids have died at Sandy Hook. And I'm like, wait a minute. Why do we have to bring the horrible tragedy of Sandy Hook in to take away the pain of your mother dying?
Yeah.
I mean, they get to stand alone. So it's exactly what you said. I mean, I get what she was doing with her post, but on some level, she could have just said, yeah, I'm missing a lot of things, period.
Yeah. Yeah. All right.
I cap it off with something nice at the end, you know.
Exactly. The courtesy.
We all do that.
All right. So one of the things I often think about are employees who are transplants to the Twin Cities. They don't have necessarily a foundation of support or community. They've got very few friends, and this social distancing creates a sense of isolation or loneliness. What counsel or advice would you offer to our employees who are experiencing that, and how to navigate through that?
To really get creative with FaceTime, and Zoom is free for 40 minutes and Skype is free. You know, I have a friend who's across the country that in my usual busy life, I would never have like more than 3 minutes on the phone with her. And we had an amazing conversation for like 40 minutes to understand that when we have this physical limitation, there actually is bigger boundaries we can cross. Like, I'm going to connect with people on FaceTime next door and across the world. And it's amazing that we can do that now. And I mean, can you imagine if this had happened 20 years ago before iPhones and Androids? And what would we be doing? We'd be sitting on a phone in our kitchen going, you know, oh, her line's busy. What's up? How to get through?
Yep. So there's just a lot of ways to connect, embrace the technology to connect beyond what the physical limitations are.
And something I'm telling myself every day as we do these kind of things, be willing to goof it up, be willing to fumble it. And, you know, it's a challenge to me and everyone else when things go wrong, but no one's really expecting perfection at this time.
Yep. No, that's fair. All right. One of the things that I talked to you about in our prep calls was, you know, our purpose as a company is making food the world loves. And there's
Which, by the way, you do. So you hear it. Mission accomplished. Mission accomplished.
And so it really has brought a profound meaning to this crisis, I think, for a lot of our employees. How do we take a step back from the grief and the loss to find meaning in the work and meaning in our personal lives. Obviously, that's the context of your most recent book. How do we search for the meaning in all this?
So after every tragedy that's happened in the world throughout history, there's post-traumatic stress that happens, and there's post-traumatic growth. The post-traumatic growth is the meaning we find. We don't find this gigantic meaning after this in 20 years. What we find is we can plant seeds right now of meaning. And the same way it's important we name grief, we need to name meaning. James, right now, you and I and hundreds of people are having a meaningful moment. I live in a block where there's probably 30 people live here. I don't think I knew 2 people's names. We're now on a text chain together. When we're going to the grocery store, can you check on the elderly man at the end of the block to make sure he's got groceries? Kids are playing out in front of their yard with their kids. I've never seen parents and kids playing together in their front lawn. It looks like something from the 50s. And those are all meaningful moments.
Yeah.
So we have to name these meaningful moments. When you're saying to a coworker, an employee, so what's this like for you? You're creating a meaningful moment, and to name it for you and for them. The food you provide is meaningful. Yeah, I've been having many meaningful moments with green beans and Haagen-Dazs and croissants, believe me, crescents.
Awesome. Well, you hit on my next question, which is many of us are parents. And I think navigating and managing a child's grief or supporting them in their grief is a bit different than colleagues and peers and relatives. And so what counsel would you provide or offer up to parents who are trying to help their children navigate this moment?
Well, it's challenging for parents because I think as parents, we want to explain things. So when a child says, I'm so mad or I'm so sad, I can't have a play date or I can't go to school or whatever it may be, we want to, in that moment, explain to them about the virus. Mm-hmm. And sometimes what we just have to go is, I know it's so sad you can't see your best friend. And I know that FaceTime isn't the same as getting together in each other's rooms or being in school together, and just sort of acknowledging their sadness, their upset, rather than us trying to explain the realities of viruses and infection control to them.
Yep. Well, and that's a nice segue to my next question, which is obviously we've talked about loss in a more abstract way. There will be colleagues and peers who will lose loved ones in all this. So I just want to kind of take a moment to acknowledge that and talk a little bit about how we can support folks when that actually does happen, and what does support for a grieving colleague look like in that situation?
So let me break this down a little bit more. I think of it as 3 groups, almost going back to the movie theater thing. There's the worried well. There's the people who they're just seeing this on the news. Everyone they know is fine. What sometimes happens with the worried well is they get anticipatory grief. They picture, oh my gosh, my loved ones could get sick. Yep. And some people will picture the worst scenario. I say, think of it like you're at a movie Cineplex and you've got a ticket to the worst movie, the scariest movie possible.
Yep.
As you picture the worst scenario, my parents could get sick. Also picture the best scenario. My parents could be fine. They could get a mild case of this. I could get a mild case of this. So picture both scenarios, the best and the worst, and just know reality is going to be somewhere in between.
Yep.
Then we have folks who are affected. They do know someone's sick. Their level of stress is going to be harder. They might be having a child or someone who's just even sick with a regular flu during all these. I mean, all those are stressors. So that's people who are really affected by it. Then we have the people, as you mentioned, that are actually having a death. That the same way your loved one wasn't able to experience all the things about having a baby, people now who have a loved one who died can't have a funeral. Their loved ones don't come over. They're not bringing casseroles. They're not bringing food. And we're a grief illiterate society.
Hmm.
We don't even know what to say to people who are grieving. You know, what we tend to do that's a mistake is point out the silver lining. Well, isn't it good they died quickly? Or maybe it's good you didn't get to see them. Or at least, I always say any sentence that begins with at least is going to be minimizing.
Yeah.
And sometimes the best thing to say is, there are no words, James, but I'm just here with you, at least virtually. I'm here with you while you're going through this pain. Because grief support isn't about doing, it's about being. I'm going to be with you, even if it's virtually. You're not going to be alone during this.
It's great. Super, super helpful. I'm going to go to Molly to see if we have any questions.
And while you're looking it
From
up,
the
I'm going to
audience.
mention, we also had talked about that, and I know you're going to follow up and send this out to people. For anyone who's actually had a death, you know, a colleague, a coworker, or you've heard of someone who's heard of someone, we actually have online grief groups right now that we're supporting each other virtually. So
Okay.
you'll send that out for, I'm
Yep.
sure, I think, for anyone who's actually had a loved one who's died.
Yeah, we've got quite a bit of resources we're going to send after, and we'll make sure that everybody gets connected to your resources as well.
So I see the question about the long spoon parable.
Yeah.
So this is a little bit about, sometimes it's in religious context, sometimes it's not, sometimes it's about heaven and hell. But this person goes into a great dining hall and they smell scrumptious food and they hear noises like there's an amazing dinner, you know, festival taking place. And they walk in and they see this huge table with people there. And they're all starving and wailing in pain. And the problem is they have these long spoons that they can pick up the food with, but they can't get it in their mouth. And so this person says to the person who's taken them in the room, you know, oh my gosh, this looks like hell. There's this amazing food you can't eat and the people are gaunt and starving. And then they're taken to another room. And in this other room, they're at the same huge table, same amazing food, same long spoons that are just too long to feed yourself. And they're all laughing and joking and celebrating together and eating. And they're eating because each one of them is using their long spoon to feed the person across from them.
Yep.
So this is a moment for us to realize, you know, we actually are our brother's keeper, our sister's keeper.
So it gets to the question I had, which is the power of service, I guess, to overcome some of the grief and the loss. Is that a fair way to frame that?
Actually, there's something powerful about helping is healing.
Yeah.
Helping is healing. You know, I went to Houston after the floods, and there were people who their homes were flooded, and I remember being up to my waist going into people's homes with them. And a man drove up in a pickup truck, and he had, I don't know, 20 pizzas and started handing the pizzas out. And I said to him afterwards, do you own a pizza company or something? He goes, no. And I said, do you live here? And he goes, no. And I said, what's this about? And he goes, I figured people would be hungry. I thought someone should bring them food.
Yeah.
And it's like, you know, one of the things is we would always rather feel guilty than helpless. And when there's a pandemic, it's easy to feel helpless. So taking some action, you're going to see on your Facebook, someone's maybe needing help. Someone's needing groceries. You can pick something up, have something delivered. Some small bit of action makes us feel less helpless.
All right, we got another one in here. As an employee, what are some of the ways to open up to your manager and share how you're feeling? I think you talked a little bit about this, but I don't know if there's anything you want to add.
Well, you know, some of us are better than others about the opening up part. So whether it's a manager or an employee, you I would say to managers, leadership is, you might acknowledge this is a challenging time for you. I mean, I think the old paradigm is, I'm your leader, nothing's bothering me.
Yeah.
I think in a pandemic, it's okay to say, this is really challenging what I'm doing. And for maybe even managers to acknowledge a little bit of that, to give your employees room.
Yeah.
Because what always happens is, and this is what happens in a general sense, we have some employee that is at the end of their rope and they're quitting and whatever it may be that is their situation, or taking a leave or an absence. And we're like, I wish I would have known sooner.
Right.
So we have to just empower them to be really open with that, to when someone comes to us and says, this is really hard, to go, James, I really appreciate you trusting me enough to come share with me how hard it is. And to validate, we're in a pandemic, of course it's hard. And what's making this hard for you? I'd like to know. And for an employee, to say to your boss, I'm having a hard time. And I wish I could say that every manager is going to do well with that.
Yeah.
Some are, some aren't.
Yep.
It might end up being a coworker that you end up sharing it with. We've seen from so many studies that having someone at work you can talk to makes all the difference in the world.
Well, and I think one of the things I wanted to hit on, obviously being in inclusion, is you mentioned it earlier. The veneer has started to come off as we see the messiness of life, and what that could potentially mean as we start to think about the meaning of all this and what it could mean for both us as individuals, but us as an organization, to kind of peel back the onion and see people as they are, could be one of the positive outcomes of how we're having to show up and support each other. So I think to your point around moments, that really is a powerful way for us to become closer and more inclusive as an organization.
And to see our authentic selves. One of the things I remember from Thanksgiving is I saw a friend of mine picture with their family at Thanksgiving, happy, smiling. I said to her, oh my gosh, your family looks so happy on Thanksgiving. She goes, you have no idea. First of all, it took 20 pictures for all of us to be looking at the camera. Aunt Sarah stormed out 5 minutes later. Uncle Fred said he was never coming back again. And you're like, oh, if I hadn't asked, I would have believed that was your family.
Yep.
And so I think this is a moment, it's interesting. I often joke about, I've just made every mistake in the world, and I'm just so open about it. And I try to laugh about it. And I don't laugh at first. It takes me a long time to laugh at the mistakes. But I think there's something so authentic and human about sort of owning those mistakes.
Yeah. All right, we've got a couple more. Without getting too deep on this one, are there any warning signals as a manager supports employees that there may need to be a more profound intervention in supporting someone as they're navigating this?
So you want to look for things that are out of character, and also look for things that are activities of daily living. So for example, if someone's late for a Zoom call, the first thing I would say to myself is, are they late anyway? I mean, it might just be their character.
Right.
There's just some people, they're late on Zoom, they were late to their day. Are there some people they don't get done, whatever it may be? So the first question is, ask yourself, is this in character for them? The other thing is, a pandemic, grief, loss, stressors magnify us, magnify our good parts and our not so good parts. So if someone can't get it together, they can't show up, they are not showering, whatever it may be, that's really speaking to having a tough time functioning, then you might know you're dealing with some deeper issues there.
Okay.
And sometimes we also have to set structure. I mean, I think, as a manager, we have to set structure. We have to think about what work life was before this. Before this, if an employee just couldn't function because of something that was going on in their personal life, I would have a conversation with them about what's going on. How can we help you in your life? Not
Yep.
just how can we make you more productive again, but
Yep.
how can we help you in your life? And I'd also have to set structure with them that I might say, listen, no matter what's going on in my personal life, still making sure your paychecks go out. I'm still making sure, the things I'm needing to do or get done. And I need you, even though things are doing, to still show up. I mean, James, despite whatever might be going on in your life, or right now, no one's got a clue what's going on in my life. We have figured out how to show up here and still do this.
Yep.
We have to let people know we're here to help them to deal with whatever's going on so that they still can show up fully and do what needs to be done.
I think I'll close on this one. I think this one's really relevant. The book you just wrote on meaning. I think it's really helpful for folks to understand why meaning is so critical to the grief process. Do you want to give just a little bit more double click into why this book was so important and why it can be so relevant at this time?
Well, just going into my world a little more, just to know the reality, and I'll put this in a context even with this pandemic. One of the things about Kubler-Ross's stages is over the years, they became 5 easy steps for grief. And anyone who's been in grief can tell you there's nothing easy or neat about it. Grief is very messy. And acceptance took on a finality that Elizabeth and I never intended it to have, that you're in acceptance and then sort of you're okay. That's not the reality. Part of what that book was about for me is a few years ago, actually over 3 years ago, my younger son unexpectedly died at 21 years old. And it was brutal and still is brutal for me. And at the same time, I knew as I was struggling with that loss, I just couldn't accept his death. I couldn't just accept it and that was that.
Yep.
Needed to find meaning. And I think it's so important as we deal with these big and little challenges to find meaning. And I'm here to say very clearly to people, even as someone who's dealt with what can be considered one of the worst losses
Absolutely.
in your life, I still think your loved one's pregnancy, what she's dealing with, those losses are important. Your kids who can't have their play date, those losses are important. So as I mentioned, all these losses have to stand alone. And how can we find meaning through this? Naming those meaningful moments is such a big deal. Acknowledging them. Think about how one woman I remember went to the post office. And as she went to the post office to get forever stamps, she said, I need 40 forever stamps. And the postal worker brings her book out and says, all right, do you want flowers? Do you want love? Do you want flags? And the woman says, I just need forever stamps. But since the book got brought out, she starts flipping through it. And she sees here these Danny Thomas stamps. And she suddenly remembers watching the Danny Thomas show with her dad, who had died many years before. And she watched the Danny Thomas show as a kid with him. She literally bought the stamps, didn't take them home and frame them. She used them as stamps. And then every once in a while, she'll pick up a stamp to pay a bill, put it on the envelope, and she has this sweet memory, meaning moment with her dad. I'll tell you, one of the things, just because I'm talking to General Mills, how could I not say this? After all the years of especially working with people dying, so many moments, meaningful moments that get passed on from generation to generation, happened over a bowl of cereal late at night. I mean, those meaningful moments. So, I think it's very easy for us to think what I do, my work, my part of the wheel doesn't matter. And the truth is, all the parts matter. Whether you're a manager, whether you're a frontline worker, it's not coming together. If we take one part out, the rest doesn't work. So whoever may be watching, I think about your work is so important, and to not diminish our work in any way or say that our work doesn't count, because your part does count. And you're the person getting the cereal there or getting the food there. That's like such an essence of what we do with one another. Food is connection. And
Yep.
I've seen so many people having Sunday dinner on Skype. Like Sunday dinners on Skype. I see photos of it. And you're part of that. You're part of making that meal happen.
Yeah, I think we can sometimes rationally make that connection, but I think this has really brought the emotion of the power of food to build connection with family and loved ones. I'm going to take one more. Is there a way to move through the stages more quickly, as I'm uncomfortable with the roller coaster of emotions? I think that the piggyback to this one too is moving through the stages linear, or is it a bit discombobulated in the way people progress?
A bit discombobulated, and it is a roller coaster, and there is no way around it. You got to go through it. One of the things in that new book that I wrote, the Finding Meaning book, I was so surprised. I didn't know this. Buffaloes can sense when a storm is coming, and they run into the storm. And because they run into the storm, they minimize the time that they're in the uncomfortable part. So what do you think about with grief and our feelings? We run from them.
Yeah, for sure.
Which means we're with them longer.
Yeah.
So to this person who wrote this, I would say, ride the roller coaster. The more you lean into those feelings, the quicker they will move through you. Our emotions need motion. So let them happen, and then we'll move through it.
It's great. All right, I am going to stop us now, because I think the power of this is taking all these amazing insights you've shared and allowing our employees to actually have some meaningful conversation with each other about how they're experiencing it, the ups, the downs, the roller coaster of emotions. But before I do that, now I'm going to apologize, but yet I'm going to try and make sure you understand how impactful this is. So when we invite speakers into General Mills, we like to recognize them. And our one brand that recognizes championship performance is Wheaties. And because of the quick turnaround on this, we could not prepare our commemorative Wheaties box for you, but I at least wanted you to show you what they look like and what you're going to get in the mail for giving your time to. Now, this is Dr. J. Yours won't look like this.
Okay.
It'll have your face on it. But it's our way of really appreciating and thanking you for spending some time with us.
That's great. I mean, literally, just the idea. We all grew up with that, and that's such a sweet, meaningful thing that you guys can do. So thank you for that. I look forward to that piece of mail.
There's some amazing real estate on the bookcase behind you. So if you want to put the Wheaties box there.
You got it. That makes my day. I can now say I have a Jeopardy question and I'm on a Wheaties box. I'm good.
That's awesome. Well, David, I really appreciate you. This has been super helpful. I think it's going to help some of our folks move through the change curve. And I just want to acknowledge what you've meant to us and what this opportunity has meant. So thank you for joining us today.
Thank all of you. And I know you're going to be sending out grief.com for anyone who needs more assistance in any way. And I'll tell you just once again, just know whatever you do with the food supply, and I don't even know everything that goes into. And you're doing a great job that I don't know. I just know I love what you do, and I so appreciate you. And I thank you all so much for the food supply, the chain that you make happen, and the great taste and the comfort. So thank you.
Thanks, David. I appreciate you.